I'm Tom Riordan, and this is the Cookieless Present. Today, I'm excited to be sitting with Ishan Bhaumik, Global Vice President at GfK MRI. Prior to his current role, Ishan was head of advanced TV at MRI and ran data partnerships at Samba and TubeMogul. He also built a mobile data startup called Velocity. Ishan, thank you for joining us today. To kick things off, would you mind telling the audience about your role at GfK MRI?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Today I work at GfK. I used to work at MRI Simmons, but I'll talk a little bit more about GfK. So I manage all worldwide relationships that GfK undertakes with Amazon, Snapchat, and TikTok. And that means all of our ad measurement products, as well as all the other things that GfK does.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's go ahead and kick things off from kind of a human angle and just talk about personal data privacy. You deal with some of these huge technology companies as your customers, but you as a consumer are someone who's always been technology interested as long as I've known you. Are you someone who, when you're dealing with tech companies, you feel comfortable with the exchange of personal data as we kind of have things set up today?
Yeah, I do. I kind of see it as inevitable, and working in the ad tech industry and various forms for 10 years now after business school. I've come to accept it. I know a lot of my peers are in various parts of the spectrum. And I do see, I deal with the creep factor, especially when I have my friends and relatives tell me like, okay, so you're in ad tech, you're the reason behind all these things that creep me out. But I think I think us getting better as an industry about the things we can do is the real key to not creeping people out. So the technology is all there. It's really just us as humans and product folks to get it better.
Sure. So what are some instances where you feel like it's something you're comfortable with and you feel good about? What are some instances where you think we might be able to do better?
Well, I think, it's not even about like doing better. I think it's about explaining ourselves better. I think, the classic example is when you're at a friend's, you're catching up with a friend at lunch and you talk about a certain product or you talk about a certain brand. And I only recently learned about this reading about how, some of the walled gardens take location data, and then they take location data of people that are logged in. And then they just check out, things as simple as search history. And then they go, okay, these two people that were in a location outside of their house were hanging out at the same place and time, and they were talking about a certain product or certain website that invokes a product. And hey, let's serve them that ad, right? It gets creepy when we don't know that. And then we go, okay, is that app listening to me? And you and I know that would never happen, right? No app's going to try to be listening to anybody at any point in time without like massive reduction in battery and all that, and not to mention a whole bunch of illegal things needing to be done. So what I think is what really happens is we as an industry just need to explain that better. If we explain it as fairly anonymized, then if that's only adding to the utility of that particular app or that particular campaign.
Sure. So in that instance, you're talking about passively gathered information from advertisers, where we're doing things based on how consumers have behaved in the past, without their permission necessarily. In the GfK world, you deal with a lot of voluntarily submitted survey-style panelist type data. So it's kind of coming from a different ballgame. Where you've actually, the arrangement between the data subject and the person who's going to use the data or the advertiser who's going to use the data is very explicit. How does that feel different to you than the passive collection of information?
Well, I think it's bulletproof in one way. It's, there is a clear exchange of incentivization. Sometimes it's monetary, right? We work for example, at my old gig at MRI Simmons, we would pay survey takers, and it would range, since it was a fairly big ask, right? But these are booklets that we would send to people's houses, or we would do in-person interviews, and that carried incentivization. And so, there's a clear value exchange in that regard. And with most panels, there is a value exchange and for the right to use our data. I'm looking forward to the day where, there is, a type of micro value exchange, like maybe it's when tokens, like the basic attention token actually takes off or something like that. When we can get actually compensated for the attention that we give to products and campaigns. Like, I think there should be a value exchange at any point in time, and that's why these old school data sets, panel data, survey data, are becoming back into fashion, and frankly, they're not going away and becoming increasingly important for the large scale deterministic data sets to calibrate them, to normalize them as well.
Right. Sure. Yep. So you were deep in that world at GfK, MRI, dealing with a lot of the survey data. Now in your role at GfK, you're dealing with some of these more global accounts. How has changes in IDs impacted those accounts and the services that they get from GfK?
Right. So, at GfK, we are a very global, very large scale company that provides market research in various forms. And a lot of it is based on two capacities or two strengths and assets. One is our sales data. We get point of sales data, often directly from the retailer and in various countries. And the other one is our capacity for media measurement. And that's, getting it from, running the panels that are the currencies in different countries for various media channels like TV or radio or even digital. So, for those data sets, there's a value exchange, and it's there's a lot of data science that goes behind making it as accurate as possible, because they have to be the currency for that particular media industry.
Yeah.
And for the data sets that are coming from the sales data, people I think overlook that, or they kind of forget about. In the ad world, like everybody's trying to find proxies for sales data, right? Like store visitation or lot visitation and things like that. But, I think most people don't realize that you can actually connect it to offline sales. And that's the holy grail for every marketer.
And basically what you're talking about is there was this perception for digital strategists over the last decade, really, that if you couldn't do user level connectivity to an action, did it even happen? And we almost ignored a lot of this offline sales data and panel-based data that a lot of times couldn't be connected to a one-to-one ID. So in your instance, right, you talked about the sales data and the media viewership. Were those kind of forgotten because they weren't attached to cookies in people's phones?
Yeah, I think what happened was people went from planning, right? And they used data sets like the data sets we're talking about today. And that stuff is really good for planning, right? Everything that's calibrated and now normalized and made representative to the US population or a population of a country's choice. That's great for planning, and that's necessary, right? But then they would find proxies for those audiences in the activation stage. Mm-hmm. And the activation stage was, everybody, I dealt with this back at TubeMogul when we worked together. Everybody's offering a different way to activate. Now, as you can see, that's kind of becoming more complicated. So people are looking back at the planning stage and going, wait, why don't we just use the data that we used to plan to activate? And then there are better ways to connect those dots, right? So there's the way that, MRI Simmons did it with partners like TransUnion and connecting that, offline data to online data sets. And then with companies like Experian and TransUnion, you don't rely on cookies. So I think there are many ways to do it. And I think connecting all the dots up and down the marketing funnel is a great thing for marketers. Right.
Okay, that makes total sense. And what about brand surveys? How do they fit in the mix? You talked about offline sales. You talked about media consumption. How do surveys fit for your brands?
Right. So there's a big topic of like brand lift, right? Is that what you're talking about? Like how to measure, like how to measure, the capacity in which going beyond performance, most marketers want to understand how can they move the needle for brand, right? And so people look to companies like us for things like brand trackers, right? And so I think there are some really interesting methodologies. Some of them are actually created by us that allow these better ways to measure long-term effects of advertising and long-term effects of brand building. And I think it's why there's like a recent resurgence. Like I think, as well as a lot of us browsing LinkedIn, that Airbnb has doubled down on its brand advertising and it's reaped the benefits. And I think this is going to be a trend in 2023. So, and I think it's, because people are looking back into tools like mixed market modeling, and those tools are more built to measure long-term effects of advertising. And when you start doing, these, somewhat longer scale or longer window look backs on certain advertising campaigns, you'll see some of the long-term effects more clearly. And not to let everything go, but we've looked at price elasticity as a measure of long-term effects of brand building. And so there's a base price and, the amount that can go up over time for certain products for a particular brand or particular campaign, that you can quantify how brand building can be measured over time. And I think those are exciting for a marketer that really wants to get back to building the brand.
Right, sure. Now, the advertisers that you tend to work with are data rich, big technology companies. Is it a paradigm shift to sell them into the idea that this might take time? They need to integrate surveys and offline sales. When you mention MMM, sometimes that's allergic to digital first type strategists, right? Do you find that there's kind of a paradigm shift that you're helping advertisers through, or do you find that a lot of folks in these marketing departments are eager for maybe a return to the basics or a return to the fundamentals?
I think it's already occurred. I mean, I honestly think this has been like a trend that's been kind of years in the making and only accelerating, right? And frankly, I think GfK can always do better in talking about how we are valuable for these mixed market modeling types of studies, but we're also bringing something to the table that others don't, which is the sales data. But outside of GfK, talking about how the big tech players themselves are looking into MMM, right? So a lot of these econometric type of methodologies and approaches, and they understand that it's going to be a requirement to not grade your own homework. So when I say not grade your own homework, all these folks already have, their own platforms, and they already have their own ways of converting or measuring offline sales lists. But I will emphasize that it's great to have third-party partners, and we're obviously not the only ones to measure how well they are doing, especially as the walled gardens get larger walls and there's more of them that come up.
Yeah, I've been thinking on a longer term standpoint, we can look at the growth of retail media networks as additional mini walled gardens, places where independent measurement might shine. When you think of the measurement strategies for your partners, could you see MMM and this independent measurement where the advertiser controls what's being compared and when? Could you see that starting to add measurability to the RMNs and the walled gardens over time?
I think so. I hope so. You mentioned RMNs. They're fascinating. And, I don't claim to be an expert by any means, but I have looked into how they follow what you and I saw in the publisher world, right? So, the publishers are building, their first party data sets, they're building their internal systems and stacks and data. And there's a learning curve, right? And it's only because, publishers, for the most part, weren't always technology first shops, right? And I think the same can be said about the Krogers of the world, right? So there's going to be a ramp up time. I think, Walmart and Amazon are doing it really well. But I think there's going to be a ramp up time for everyone else. And it's just going to be, a measure of the skill set and the talent base. And up until then, all the first party data in the world isn't going to help retail media networks, do the right thing with that data, right? To make sure that you're approaching, the customer journey properly.
Right. Yep. I think that makes total sense. And you mentioned there being kind of an evolution that has to happen within that space. Let's use that as a chance to talk about organizational preparedness, both at your peers and at the larger industry. When you look at GfK, do you feel like you're at an organization where ID changes to the landscape, the cookieless revolution? Is this stuff top of mind, and you feel like you kind of have the right playbook in place to address a lot of these, or do you feel like there's still more that you guys could be doing as an org?
I think it is absolutely top of mind. Do I think that we could be doing more? Absolutely. Especially being in the seat where I am at, where I'm working a lot with let's say the ad measurement folks at these large tech players. They're telling me anecdotally that, they need more support, and they need more products, and they need it faster, and they need it with, let's say, smaller sample sizes, and they need it in more countries. And I think as an industry, we all need to do better. Now, I am encouraged that there have been a lot of like private equity moves. There's a lot of mergers in our particular corner of the space, like NPD and IRI, and for us, it's Nielsen IQ combining with GfK. So I can't speak much about the merger between GfK and Nielsen IQ, but we're really excited about the potential of putting together a lot of different sales data sets together on behalf of our clients. And this is, we can talk more about it when the deal actually closes. But I think it's just going to be tremendously exciting for the folks that are in our space collecting different data sets for offline use.
Okay, awesome. So you feel like on the tech and the ad tech front, there's companies making the right moves to allow the sort of things we need to do in the future to stay relevant as advertisers. When you look on the ad side and you look at the buy side, do you think, you mentioned that as advertisers asking for things, are they taking enough action on their end? Or do you think there's maybe more that you'd want to see from the buy side or from advertisers themselves?
Well, this is somewhat of a selfish answer, but I'd love advertisers to make sure that they're getting independent sources of measurement and independent sources of that quality, right? And then making sure that they, it's already so hard for the buy side, right? Because these new channels are popping up, and CTV is taking off, and there's the whole thing about how to measure CTV and what's the currency for TV. So that's, it's not like the headaches are getting any smaller for the buy side. I think these are growing pains, and it can only be better once we're in a spot where we get holistic measurement for all the channels, and it's apples to apples, truly. So one way of doing that is making sure that going back to the pitch I had for MRI Simmons, making sure what you use to plan across all the channels is what you're using to activate across all the channels. So at least you have apples to apples from planning to activation. At GfK, we could say, okay, well, now connect it with stuff that you actually care about, which is sales data, or make sure that you're working with a partner that has the highest quality in panel data and survey data, because we are the currencies in different countries all over the world.
So even as independent measurement potentially becomes more difficult, as data scarcity becomes more of a problem, some of the walled gardens the walls are only getting greater. You think now is the time to not be intimidated by that, though? It's still time to lean in and get your independent measurement framework right.
Yes, and there are certain walled gardens that I think are doing well to be agnostic, right? And I do have to give it up to Meta in this regard. Like, they've open sourced a lot of there's certain projects that they've open sourced in terms of in measurement, and I think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was catching up with someone from Meta this morning about GLF and Robin, and just the fact that they've chosen to make that stuff available, and they've built communities where people can kind of throw darts at the methodology and compare it against Google's open source GLF methodology, which is another great thing. It feels like it's a time where the details are out of the woodwork, right? And we can kind of collaboratively talk about the future of GLF, the future of MMM, and the future of ID-less measurement.
Yeah, and let's talk about GeoLeft in general, I think, right now it's the walled gardens that are doing GeoLeft well because they are able to target so easily and so granularly, right? I think once this becomes more and more available to marketers, companies that have things like sales data, the way that we run our GeoLeft studies, it's very important for us to turn on and off the campaign in certain areas. That's why we can do A/B testing, and our always on sales data can then just see there's the differences in the correlation in sales data compared to where there was exposed versus unexposed. All that is made possible with GeoLeft, from the walled gardens, like granular targeting based on geography, and it's also possible by companies that have store level granularity. So I hope that once store level granularity is becoming more and more important because of these GeoLeft studies, then GfK will be in a better position.
Sure. Well, with that, Ishan, we talked about the value of offline and panel-based data sets. We talked about the value of independent measurement. We talked about combining your planning data with your activation data. Any other notes that you want to end on? Any other advice you'd like to leave our audience today?
No, I mean, I just want to say thank you. We've been connected since the TubeMogul days, Tom, and you're always, the sharpest tool in the shed for at TubeMogul for many different things. So you were my go-to when I would have questions about, all these measurement aspects. So I'm happy to help in any way, shape, or form. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you on behalf of our audience for joining us. So if you enjoyed what you saw today, feel free to click that subscriber bell on my profile. And thank you for joining us for the Cookieless Present. Cheers.
Thank you.